Hello constant readers, my name is Emily and welcome back to the Dark Tower Project. In today's video, we're going to be talking about metafiction and how I see metafiction working in the Dark Tower series. I think before we talk about metafiction, it's important to talk about postmodernism. I just want to say, like right off the bat, if you are studying for an exam on postmodernism, this is not the video to do it. This is sort of a nutshell postmodernist thing. Let's try and understand what postmodernism is. Postmodernism is a literary movement that resists literary definition, which is why I'm saying let's try and understand postmodernism together. The movement itself is pretty against the idea that things can be neatly defined and fit in like clearly defined boxes. One of the major ideas of the postmodernist movement is that everything has been done before. So in literature, we're looking at how every story has been told, nothing is 100% original. And I feel like this is something that we really see at work throughout the Dark Tower series. It seems to me that postmodernist literature is really about playing with the possibilities of literature. It's having fun, it's experimenting with literary techniques, it's experimenting with things that have come before it. And so we can see that the movement has been known to test boundaries. So I'm going to go through some common postmodernist literary elements and talk about how I see them at work in the Dark Tower series. So a key feature of postmodernist literature is paradox. And so a paradox is defined as something that leads to a conclusion that seems senseless, logically unacceptable, or self-contradictory. The well-known example of paradox is the liar paradox, which is this statement is false. If this is true, then the sentence is false. But if the sentence states that it is false, and it is false, then it must also be true. I think we see paradox at work with Cy King. We know at a certain point that Roland, Father Callahan, Eddie, Susanna, Jake, that they are characters in a work of fiction. But we've met them before we've met the writer, and we meet the writer before he's even thought of the characters. So somehow these fictional characters have come into existence and have existed before they've been written or dreamed up in the author's mind. And so there's this sort of paradoxical element of like true, not true, alive, not alive, real, not real thing happening with the characters that I think gets us to think about the nature of fiction. So another element of postmodernist literature is fragmentation. The idea here is that the artist is impotent and the only recourse against ruin is to play with this chaos. And I think playing with chaos is a pretty apt description of just the Dark Tower series as a whole. Many novels contain fragments of stories. I think we see that playing with chaos, especially when we get connections to Yeats' idea of the gyre. The idea with the gyre is that nothing is wholly original. A history is a repeating series of events and people, characters, and that history is always spiraling out from a point of order to a point of chaos, and then that moment of chaos, order is born and it starts spiraling out again. I could probably insert an image on the screen so that you can see it, opposed to just me making swirls, invisible swirls with my fingers. The Dark Tower series is set in a where and when where time doesn't flow logically or rationally. It's a time of chaos. And so I think we see the series playing with that. Another feature of postmodernism is that there is no clear beginning and no clear ending. I mean, that is what the Dark Tower series is, right? We open the Gunslinger with the paratext that says 19, resumption, and then the man in black fled across the desert and the gunslinger followed. The conclusion of the Dark Tower, which is the 7th book in the series, Roland touched the horn again and its reality was oddly comforting, as if he had never touched it before. Time to get moving. The man in black fled across the desert and the gunslinger followed. So this book circles right back into the first book, right? There's no clear beginning, no clear ending to this series. In this moment, we see the gyre starting over again. We've gone from a point of chaos back to a point of order with the beginning of the narrative, with that sentence. The repetition of that sentence is at once a moment of chaos and order for us as readers, right? When you realize that the series is sweeping you right back around to the very first book, it's probably a pretty chaotic, jumbled thing to get in your head, to realize that there isn't really a satisfying conclusion, but it's also a point of order. Like, it's a reintroduction to this thing. It reframes your whole experience with the series to know that it exists within this gyre, it exists within this repetition. I guess if you want to think about it as music, you have your repeat symbol. Within those symbols, that repeats. That is my sense of the Dark Tower series. So there is no clear ending, there's no clear beginning, it literally just repeats over and over. Another feature of postmodernist literature is fabulation, which is a rejection of realism and an embracing of the idea that literature is a created work. It integrates traditional notions of storytelling with fantastical elements, magic, myth, elements of popular genres. And I think we see this happening in the Dark Tower series a lot. This embracing of the idea that what we are reading is consciously created. I think especially when we get the introduction of the author into this otherwise fictional narrative, it makes us aware that what we are reading is fiction. Like, it really calls attention to that. We have intertextuality, which we talked about in a whole separate episode, intertextuality and what it does. We can see intertextuality very much at work in the Dark Tower series. And I think the most important thing, and one of the more interesting things, is metafiction. Metafiction is a huge part of postmodernist literature. It's used to undermine the authority of the author or to comment on the act of storytelling itself. Metafiction is fiction in which the author self-consciously alludes to the literariness of a work. This is done by parodying or diverting from novelistic conventions, especially that of naturalness or traditional story techniques. It openly draws attention to the fact that what you are reading is a fragment of someone's imagination. It poses some really important philosophical and critical questions about the relationship between fiction and reality. In a nutshell, metafiction is fiction about fiction. Fiction that deliberately reflects upon itself. Common metafictional elements include a story about a writer who creates a story that features itself as a narrative or as a physical object, a story that contains another work of fiction within itself, a story that reframes or suggests a radically different reading of another story, a story addressing the specific conventions of story, a novel where the narrator exposes themselves as the author of the story, a novel where the author refers to elements of a story as both fact and fiction, a story where the characters are aware they are in a story where characters make reference to the author or their previous works. All of these things that I have listed, there are other aspects of metafiction, but all of these aspects that I have listed on the screen apply to the Dark Tower series. I just want to talk about some of the quotes throughout the series that demonstrate that metafiction has been at work throughout the whole Dark Tower series. In the Wastelands, we have, quote, "He holds us all within his mind," end quote, and that's on page 196. And the question is, who? Who holds you all within their minds? It's the author. The second quote from there is, quote, "It was easy to hurt little kids, easy to make them cry, and this seemed to bring out a strangely sadistic streak in many storytellers," on page 230. And I feel like at that point we're thinking about Jake and what the author is doing to Jake as a small child. Then in Wizard and Glass, we have on page 109 an indication that The Stand, which is another piece of fictional work, exists, and that the superflu didn't happen in Eddie's world, Eddie's Where or When. It happened in another 1986 America. So the idea of parallel fictional worlds resting next to each other like books on a shelf. And then we have, quote, "Go then, there are other worlds than these," end quote, on page 115. So again, we get the idea that there are other fictional spaces, multiple worlds, multiple universes, multiple fictional spaces for people or for characters to exist in. On page 945, they talk about how Abigail is part of another story, a story that is, quote, close to this one, next door maybe, end quote. And so that is, of course, referring to Abigail from The Stand and how, again, she's part of another story, she's part of another piece of fiction, and that the two worlds are side by side like books on a shelf. So I think those really call to the, like, books as physical objects, the story within them as things that rest next to each other. In Wolves of Akala, we have on page 40 the idea that Salem's Lot overlaps with the Dark Tower world. We see a Stephen King book for sale in Jake's 1977 on page 70. Then page 138 to 140, we meet Donald Callahan from Salem's Lot. We meet somebody who is real from a work of fiction. On page 214 to 217, Eddie comments on how their encounter with Kala and the quest seems, quote, just not real, end quote. And I feel like at that moment, Eddie is starting to question whether or not he's fictional, having met somebody who is fictional. And I wonder if at that moment he's suspecting that their narrative, that their quest for the Dark Tower is the product of somebody's imagination, and he's starting to question whether or not his actions are within his control, right? That the quest seems not real, the quest seems plotted. Then on page 216, we get a lot of fictional elements, the idea that they're in a, quote, storybook town, end quote, with, quote, a fairy tale problem, and a band of movie show heroes and fairy tale villains. So the idea that everybody in this town, they seem as if they are out of a fairy tale or a storybook. They're not real people. We see on page 781 to 782, quote, a novel is a story, isn't it? A made-up story. Yes, that's what fiction means. Made, make-believe. Roland pondered this. Charlie the Choo-Choo had also been make-believe, only in many ways it hadn't been, and the author's name had changed. There were many different worlds, all held together by the tower. Maybe, no, not now. He mustn't think about these things now, end quote. And so we have here Roland questioning, I think, whether or not he too is fiction. He's met somebody who's fictional. He keeps encountering fictional elements that are real or real things that appear in fiction. And there's this blurring happening for him. And then on page 921, we find the novel Salem's Lot by Stephen King, which tells Callahan's life story perfectly. And we have, quote, I am not a fiction. Am I? End quote on page 924. So Callahan is questioning whether or not he's a real person, because he lives himself as real, he feels real, but he sees his life story that he's lived perfectly captured in fiction. Then in Song of Susanna, we have, quote, we've been haunted by books, end quote, in a conversation that's taking place on 224 to 231. This is also the book with stanza 11, where the characters meet Cy King. And Cy King talks about how Roland was a character in his head, but then he lost the outline for the story, and the story keeps sort of getting away from him. The first line of his manuscript is how our physical object, the gunslinger, opens. So we have this real object reflected in the real object that we're reading, and it's a work of fiction in the fiction. And it's asking us to think about real and not real. It's bringing into question everything that we've encountered as readers. And then in The Dark Tower, on page 20, we learn that Cy King hasn't created Eddie yet. On page 174, the characters reflect on objects conveniently showing up. The objects are obviously from Cy King, and it's a conscious acknowledgement of the deus ex machina, the God fix, right? Like the characters are in trouble, so Cy King writes the solution in and fixes the problem for his characters who are both real and not real. On page 192 to 193, Susanna wants to bring Cy King's works on their quest as a resource, but Roland doesn't want them because they might confuse them. So the idea that reading something by Cy King might influence how they feel agentic how they move through the world and fudge up their own story. So by becoming aware of the fiction, it might ruin the reality of their experience, if that makes sense. So there's a resistance of, I guess, acknowledging the fiction. Then there's the idea that The Stand, the novel The Stand, is just another level of the tower on page 215. On page 219, we learn that Roland has, quote, lived too long, end quote. He's immortal as long as he exists in reader consciousness. He lives beyond his living, breathing life by existing in our heads. We bring life to Roland every time we pick up his story. Then on page 634 to 640, we learn that the Tet Corporation has folks researching Size King novels to see what, quote, touches on the Dark Tower in one way or another, end quote. I think it's pretty clear that the Dark Tower series can be considered postmodernist literature. It has some pretty key postmodernist traits, and it, to me, makes the Dark Tower series stand apart from your standard genre fiction. Like, the Dark Tower series is marketed as genre fiction. It's lumped in to the horror section, which is genre fiction. It's not literary fiction, but most postmodernist fiction is considered like highly literate. It's things that there are university courses devoted to studying because it's so worthy of scholarly exploration to look at the ways in which authors are challenging the limits of fiction and butting up against the limits of fiction. It's interesting that something so literary is so widely read, it's so widely loved, and loved by people who exist outside of the academy, outside of the university, and yet the university almost wholly ignores it. Like, I have tried so many times to find scholarly analysis on the Dark Tower series, and I keep hitting walls. Now, whether that's because of what my university libraries have access to, whether that's because when I started this project I did still have access to McMaster's database, the journals there, and then now it's whatever I can access for free through Google Scholar. Like, there really doesn't seem to be a large body studying this work specifically, and I feel like that's a real missed opportunity, right? Like, even as a teacher, like, I took a course specifically on 20th century postmodernist literature. You think that in teaching that course to undergrad students, it could be really helpful to start in a place that isn't super literary and high-reaching, that it would be helpful to introduce a lot of these postmodernist concepts in a text that is really easily digestible. Like, before you move into something like Malone Dies by Samuel Beckett, or Hawksmoor by Peter Ackroyd, or Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. Like, before you move into those postmodernist texts that are thinking about the act of writing fiction. So those are my thoughts on postmodernism and metafiction and how I see them at work in the Dark Tower series. I would love to hear your thoughts on postmodernism and metafiction in the comments down below. I do want to mention the Red Rum Book Club, which is a Stephen King book club for my patrons. It is available to patrons at all tiers, so for $1, $3, or $5 a month, you can join the club. You will be part of the discussions and the live shows at the end of each month. We have to thank my patrons. Thank you, patrons, for making the Dark Tower series possible. Your support while bringing this series to life has been wonderful. I really appreciate the work that you enable me to do, so thank you, patrons. If you are watching the Dark Tower series and you've been following along and you see how much work has gone into this series and you want to say thank you, you want to support the amount of labor that has gone into this series and support future projects, links to my Patreon page will be in the description box down below. So thank you guys for watching, and until next time, long days and pleasant nights.